Welcome to Casual Friday. Hi, I'm Roxanne Richardson, and this is my weekly Casual Friday podcast. In this podcast, I have tidbits. I have a big box of vintage knitting books to open up, and I have my first project in my sock journey to study the evolution of socks. I have my first project finished. So let's get started. This first tidbit showed up in my Twitter feed. It's a video clip from The Late Show with Stephen Colbert. For those of you outside the US, this is a late night talk show. Throughout the pandemic, Stephen Colbert has asked small business owners to submit videos about their businesses, and then he's featured those videos on his show in order to give them the small biz bump. The video that I am going to link to down below is the 10-minute opening monologue for Stephen Colbert's show, and within it, he features a couple of different small businesses. But it's the final one that I think a lot of you are really going to love. It starts at about the 6-minute point if you want to jump forward through the video. The video is for a yarn shop in Cleveland, Ohio. But not only does he show the video that was submitted by the shop's owner, the show took it a step further by creating an entire fake TV crime show using actors from NCIS. In this little film, the crochet killer is on the loose, and they're trying to figure out where he gets all his supplies that he uses for his crime spree because they're so amazing. The whole thing was brilliantly done, in part because it's really clear that someone on their writing staff is very familiar with textiles and the crafts of knitting and crocheting. The crochet killer is seen on surveillance cameras wearing an actual crocheted mask and mitts. So clearly someone knows the difference between crochet and knitting. At one point, they walk into a scene and one of the actors says, "Someone died here," and then they're marveling at the fabric that was dyed by an independent dyer. So I really hope that the owner of Fine Points in Cleveland, Ohio has seen an increase in business, because that was such a fantastic piece of work. So I will leave a link down below so you can see the video. This next tidbit also showed up in my Twitter feed. It's a documentary about Paisley Thread, but not just about Paisley Thread. It's about what was done with the thread. So Paisley, Scotland is a really important part of textile history, and the documentary does touch on the fact that thread was manufactured in Paisley, but it really explores what people did with that thread. There was an entire industry centered around whitework within Paisley starting in the 1780s, as well as embroidery that was done, colorful embroidery that was done on fabrics that was then turned into fashionable clothing items. And this went on throughout the 19th century and into the early 20th century. So the documentary explores this history, but also what is happening currently to connect people today with that culture of textile history through community projects. They talk about how embroidery and the act of it is very personal and meditative. It can be political, and it can represent things that only the embroiderer can know and understand. The documentary is about 26 minutes long. And for those of you who might struggle a little bit with understanding Scottish accents, the entire documentary is subtitled. Once again, this tidbit showed up on my Twitter feed. It's a time-lapse video of the Natural History Museum dressing an almost full-scale T-Rex, a model of a T-Rex, in a sweater. They actually call it a jumper, which was my clue that this must be a museum in the UK, and it is indeed the Natural History Museum in London. It's interesting to see the process of doing something that's on that kind of a scale, and the approach to solving that problem of how do you how do you measure a T-Rex and then make a sweater to fit it? Because a T-Rex has really oddly shaped body parts, this giant head, a giant body, and these little tiny arms. So they start out with this very large loop of fabric that's fairly wide that they know is going to fit around the largest circumference. And then they take more detailed measurements and they figure out exactly where the arms are. They cut holes for it. They make sure that when they turn on the motorized movements that the sweater is still going to move with the T-Rex. And so they do all that. They take the sweater off of it and then they return later with ribbing that has been added for the sleeves and also for the neck. And at one point they're even adding fabric to the sweater while it is on the T-Rex. I just found it to be a really interesting problem-solving exercise to figure out how to make a knitted item that would fit something like that. So the whole video is probably 45 seconds long, so I've spent a lot longer talking about it than it actually takes to view it. But I also stopped that video numerous times and then rewound it in order to watch what they were doing, because I thought it was such a clever process that they underwent. This tidbit came to me from Sandra on Instagram. It's a short video about a knitter who lives in Newfoundland, Canada, and who has been knitting for an organization called Nonia for more than 30 years. I had a vague memory of reading about Nonia a few years back, but I couldn't quite remember what it was. And it turns out that Nonia stands for the Newfoundland Outport Nursing and Industrial Association. So their website explains that they were incorporated as a nonprofit business in 1924 after being founded in 1920, and it was established to assist Newfoundland outport communities so that they could access health services by raising money from the sale of hand-to-knit garments to pay the salaries of the public health nurses. In 1934, in the middle of the Depression, when the area was under financial crisis, the healthcare portion of Nonia's operation was taken over by the government, but the industrial side was maintained and continues today in much the same tradition as when it was founded. So knitters and weavers throughout the area in these outport areas, so these are other islands off the main island of Newfoundland, or ports within that main part of the island that are more remote. It gives those people an opportunity to make money, earn income, and then those items are sold in the Nonia storefront in St. John's. When they said that the government took over healthcare in 1934, I wasn't really clear on which government that would have been. I think my understanding is that Newfoundland and Labrador were independent of Canada and the UK at this time. And it seems like, and if somebody in Canada understands how this worked, please update us down in the comments. So I'm thinking that what happened in 1934 was that they once again became a British colony and that they were supported in some way by Great Britain, but I'm not really clear. But anyway, this little video is about a specific woman who became widowed in her 50s. She had 7 kids. She had been a housewife and had no means of bringing in income. So she turned to knitting as a way of bringing in some income in order to support herself and her 7 children. So I'll leave a link down below to the Nonia website, but also to that video about this particular woman and her story down in the show notes. So in the past couple of weeks, the topic of Weldens has come up on episodes of Casual Friday. So Weldens was a publication that started in 1886, I believe, in the UK. And they were the first monthly publication that was devoted strictly to needlework. There were a lot of women's magazines that included needlework in them, but this is the first one devoted to needlework. So each issue was numbered sequentially from the starting point. So number 1 was the first issue. Number 45 would have been, you know, an issue in like the 4th year, etc. The volume number indicates a year. So volume 1 was all 12 of the issues that were published in 1886. Volume 2 was all of the issues published in 1887, etc. And then when they published an issue is on a very specific topic of needlework. It could be knitting, crocheting, tatting, macrame. It could be a stocking knitting, which was separate from just the knitting category. And those were numbered separately as a series. So in the first year that Weldon's Practical Needlework was published, there were 4 issues that were devoted to knitting, and so those would be series 1 through 4 of knitting. There were 2 issues that were devoted to stocking knitting, so those were series 1 and 2 of stocking knitting. So every issue is going to have like 3 different numbering systems that are associated with it. What series it is, what actual sequential number in all of the Weldon's Practical Needlework, and then what volume that it's in. So Juno 5 posted in my Ravelry group a couple of weeks ago that she had found volume 11 of Weldon's Practical Needlework on archive.org. I went and I took a look at it. So that would have been, volume 11 would be from 1896, and it would be all 12 of those issues. And Juno 5 said she was going to be knitting a pair of stockings that she had found in that particular volume. And I don't see any other issues or volumes or anything else of Weldon's on archive.org, which is kind of interesting because it should be in the public domain. So if you were interested in looking at a free, you know, volume of Weldon's just to see what it's like, I will leave a link to archive.org to that particular volume down below. I mentioned that somebody had asked about this book because they couldn't see the volume. A number of people recently have been saying how they spend a lot of time pausing the videos to try to read the titles that are on the books behind me. And I should say that this is only a portion of my knitting library. I have many other books around this office. The ones I use most are in shelves that are within reach of my desk. And I have done sort of a tour of my knitting library. I haven't done one in a few years. I did it over a series of weeks where I would cover a particular topic in a given week. And I will, if I can figure out which episodes they were, I will leave links down below. But I think it was in 2019, in the fall of 2019. So the episodes would be like in the 30s to the 40s, somewhere in there, if you were just wanting to go look. But what I thought I would do is just take my camera and kind of go shelf by shelf and then pan kind of slowly across so that you can kind of get an idea of the books that I do have. And you won't be able to see every single title, I'm sure, but if you have any questions about any of them, like if you see a particular book, you can't make out the title, if you give me some context of what shelf you saw it on, like what are the books around it that you can read, and then give me a description of the book that you're wondering more about, I'd be happy to give you whatever information I can about those particular books. So now that you've seen my library, what's on the shelves of my library, I have to say that I am running out of room for books. And so just as I sometimes go through my yarn and just get rid of things that I am not going to ever use for a project, I'm about ready to go through some of my books. I've gotten rid of books, some books in the past, but I think I'm going to go through and get rid of some more, or at least move certain types of books to a different location, possibly outside of my office. And the reason is because I received a very large package today. And when I saw how big it was in reality versus how large the contents looked in the tiny little photo online, I realized I did not have room for what was in that box. Now, I did record earlier an unboxing of this, and then I don't even want to go into what happened to all my footage, but that footage does not exist anymore. So instead, I will tell you that what was in that box were facsimile editions of the first 12 volumes of Weldon's Practical Needlework. So years ago, I don't know, 15, 20 years ago, something like that, Piecework magazine was contacted by a rare bookseller and that had 30 volumes of Weldens and asked them, would they be interested in buying them? And they said, absolutely. And so when they received them, they digitized the contents of them, and then they produced these facsimile editions, certainly of the first 12. I don't know how many of those volumes that they created in, facsimile editions for. They no longer publish the hardcover versions of these. You can still get digitized copies of various Weldon's Practical Needlework, but the way that they package them is through series. So like Practical Stocking Knitter Series 1 and 2, which were in the very first year, the first volume of Practical Needlework, those are sold together as a package, a digitized package. So I couldn't find anything on their website that showed that they sold like digitized versions of the whole volumes. So there is that volume 11 that you can see on archive.org. So I bought these as a package. I started to look for them sort of separately, and I saw that there was a seller that had them all together, and then I just compared, like, what if I bought them all individually? And it was basically the same price, maybe even a little bit cheaper to get them all together. And it was just a lot more convenient. So that's how I got them. What I think I'm going to be doing, because I only got these like right before I started recording today, I think each week I'll go through like the topics that are covered in here, and specifically the ones that are related to knitting, and I might also share the crocheting ones, so that if you see a particular series that you think would be interesting, then you would know how you could get hold of that through Piecework, because you could still get them if you wanted them. Or you could try to track down some of these facsimile volumes yourself. But I'm really excited to take a look at this, because these 12 volumes are going to represent like 1886 to 1897. So I just think that'll be a really interesting time period. And in particular, I'm interested in the stockings, of course. But I will share those with you as I investigate what's inside these, as soon as I can find a place to put them in my library. So the past couple of weeks, I have been talking about this sock that was knit by a Norwegian knitter in Norway, who's born sometime in the early 20th century, shortly after the turn of the century. And she's been dead for a couple of decades. And her relative, who owns the sock, could not remember how to knit the heel. There was a special technique used in the heel that she could not remember. And one of the things that struck me about this heel, as soon as I saw it, was that, well, I recognized the silhouette of the heel as being one that I'd seen in Weldon's Practical Stocking Knitter. But then when we began examining the sock and looked at it from the inside, I could tell that there was a real difference in how this particular heel was finished off compared to everything I'd ever read about this type of heel in the past. I thought, well, this would be a good sock to start off my sock journey of investigating the evolution of socks and stockings, and see how techniques have changed over time and how patterns have been presented to the knitters. So I've had a couple of questions when I talk about socks versus stockings. I had a question in the comments last week from someone who English is her second language, and she was a little confused about my use of socks versus stockings, and she just wondered if it was a language difference or a cultural difference or what the issue was, and could I explain the difference between socks and stockings. So it very well could be a combination of generation, culture, language, all of those types of things. When I was growing up in the 60s, if my mother was getting dressed up to go out, she would put on a girdle. And that girdle might have little straps, elastic straps hanging down from it with little clips on it, or she might put on a separate garter belt, is what we would call it in the United States. Other countries might call them suspenders. What we call suspenders are things that men wear to hold up their pants, which other places are going to call trousers. So there's a lot of the same words even within English in different places that people have different definitions for. The stockings that my mother was wearing were nylon, and they came up to somewhere in the middle of her thigh. So I have always thought of stockings as being something that comes up over the knee and into the thigh. And anything at or below the knee is something that I would think of as a sock. When I was kind of going through all of my vintage books last week, I was also going through the books that I have on sock traditions, and one of them was this book, Estonian Knitting. It's volume 2, Socks and Stockings. And in this book, there is a picture, a spread of socks and stockings from different regions of Estonia and also from different time periods that represent different cultural traditions. And one of the things that she mentions in the book is that in Estonia, the stockings never came above the knee. And she said in some countries and some regions of the world, they would refer to these as knee socks. But here in Estonia, they would have been stockings. And I thought, oh, that's really interesting, that distinction, that what I would call a knee sock, they would call a stocking, because they didn't have anything that was above that. And I realized, let me just see if I can get my foot up here, that I am actually wearing a knee sock today. So I think these are socks I finished. I knit them this year, I believe. And so I have knit a few pairs of knee socks, and they do take longer than what I think of as a regular sock, which is something that would end, right here. So a knee sock is going to have calf shaping. So would a stocking that was even longer would have some shaping at the calf. But the knee sock I can keep up on my own. I don't have to have a garter or something holding it up, although I have heard people talk about that they used to wear some kind of an elastic band under the turnover part of their knee socks in order to keep them from falling down. So some people do use those to keep their knee socks up, and other people don't. So when I think about the fact that it really wasn't that bad to knit a pair of knee socks, that maybe it really wouldn't be that bad to go a little bit further and knit a pair, well, maybe not a pair of stockings, but one stocking. The thing is, I don't have any use for a stocking that comes up to my thigh, and I don't want to have to wear a garter or something like that. But it does kind of open me up to, oh, there are stockings that would be interesting to knit that wouldn't be, take so long as one of these thigh-high stockings. And then I was reminded of this online auction that I had won earlier in the year, like I think in February. It was for a dozen pair of stockings, and what I loved about them were all the amazing colors. So here's one pair of those stockings. So they they had the knitter's initials on the stockings. Almost every pair has the initials MM on them. And then the stockings, the pairs were numbered, most of them. And they were numbered anywhere from very low single digits up into the 30s, but there was 12 pairs that I had. And when I got them, I held them up to my leg, and I thought, well, these aren't that long. They only come up to the knee. Was this person super short? Because in my head, stockings from the 19th century came up into the thighs, and these were dated to the 1860s. So what I've learned is that the fashion in stockings in like the UK and the US, that the length of stockings, the fashion changed over the course of the century. They got longer and they got shorter and they got longer again. So it really varied. And one of the things about the 1860s was that they had a lot of really colorful stockings. That was the fashion. And they came only up to the knee. So I thought that was really interesting. Now these are knit at a crazy gauge of like 12 to 15 stitches per inch. And it's knit in cotton, which I would not, like there's nothing about that I would want to replicate. But it did remind me that a stocking could be of all kinds of lengths. And just because I think of that as a knee sock, I wouldn't think of this as a knee sock because it's not going to stay up on its own. But I'd be curious to know what you guys think of as the difference between a sock and a stocking. Do you make a differentiation based on whether it comes higher than the knee, or is it always a stocking to you regardless of how long it is? You can leave that down in the comments because I'm really interested to know how that varies by culture, language, region, generation, all of that. So I wanted to replicate this sock. I've been talking about this sock for the past couple of Casual Fridays, and in particular, how this heel was turned or finished along the bottom here was fascinating. And so many of you have thought that is something so unusual that you've never seen that before. And so quite a few of you are interested in knitting the sock. And so I will be publishing a pattern in a couple of weeks. And I think what I'm going to do is publish the pattern based exactly on how the original knitter knit this. It took me two socks, knitting the whole pair, which I have here, for me to figure out every one of the techniques that she used. Because I've knit socks for so long, and I've built a set of assumptions about how things tend to be constructed. And so I was looking at the sock, and that started with the heel, like having an assumption about how the heel was done and then turning the sock inside out and going, wait a second, this isn't adding up. And so there were a couple of places in this sock where I made, I made an educated assumption about how things were done, and then I couldn't reconcile what I thought was going on with what I could see was going on. And so it took me several tries to try to get through all of that. So I promised that I would get the pattern for this sock done in the next couple of weeks. And so I'm going to write it exactly the way she knit it. And then I'm going to maybe give some notes about or suggestions about how things could be done differently and still end up with the same result, but how you might be able to do a few things differently. What's so interesting to me about this heel in particular, not just the way that the heel was shaped, but even the way she picked up stitches along the sides of the heel, gave me the evidence of what I was reading in some of these really old knitting books, and then answering questions that I had about, well, if you were going to do that, how would you do this other thing? So this is just such a great sort of living document for how the techniques that I've seen written about that we don't use today, how they could have been done. So one of the things about this particular sock, in terms of the gauge it's knit at, the stitch count, the stitch pattern that's used, which is ribbing, is that they all combine in order to create a sock that is wearable by probably most adults, including my giant brother, who I knit socks for because his feet and legs are so big that commercial socks bother him, that I could knit him a sock using these stitch counts and just knit it to long enough to fit his foot. And I think it would fit him. Now, I mentioned all the time that I have kind of some fit issues when it comes to socks. I have two fit issues that go in sort of opposite directions, which combine to make kind of even more difficult fit problems. One is that I have kind of a skinny ankle, and so I need to knit the socks smaller. And then because it's smaller, it has a smaller number of stitches. And the way that sock formulas work with the heel, if I use the standard formulas for the heels, I get a shorter sock heel, and my heel is super long. And so I need a much longer heel than what the formula is going to create for my foot. So that was something that's been interesting to me, is to see, well, you know, how does this fit me? Would it fit my brother? You know, what is the range of feet that this would fit? Now, to me, this is suitable to wear as a house sock. A number of people have said, oh, you could wear this as a boot sock. And for me, the only kind of boot that I would want to wear this particular sock that was knit at this gauge with this number of stitches would be maybe a rain boot. I wouldn't wear them with my winter boots, because I don't wear socks with my winter boots. They're lined with sheepskin and they're warmer without any socks. I wouldn't wear them with my fashion boots because they would be too thick to begin with, but there's just so much extra fabric that it would be very bunchy. And I don't even know that I'd wear these with hiking socks. I would have to modify the stitch count to change the fit of the sock in order to want to wear it inside of something like a hiking boot. But I could potentially see wearing these in a rain boot. So I don't know if that's what people mean by boot socks or what they mean. So the circumference of this sock looks pretty narrow because it's in ribbing, and ribbing pulls in. The stitch count, if you were to knit this in stockinette stitch, this sock would be 9.5 inches in circumference, which would be way too big for me. I knit my socks to be 7 inches in circumference so that they stretch to fit my 8-inch ankle. But because this pulls in, it will pull in and fit to, you know, the contours of my leg, and that's okay. But that's it's still extra fabric for the instep, more fabric than I actually need. And like I said, it's comfortable for me to walk around as a house sock, but it's too much fabric. It pulls in, but the fabric still exists. It's just existing in a three-dimensional way. It does make this a very sort of flexible sock to knit if you just wanted to try this kind of cool heel, or if you've never knit socks and you just wanted to try on something that would be fairly fast and that would be fit, you know, a range of feet without expecting or demanding too much from how the sock performs when you're actually wearing it with footwear. So I will be writing up the sock pattern the way that the original knitter knitted, and then also including a little bit of alternatives that you could do if you wanted to. So that should be out, I'm hoping, in a couple of weeks that you'd be able to get a copy of that pattern. So this is the way a normal sock would fit for me. It's very form-fitting. I knit it so that it's smaller than my actual foot and that it stretches to fit. And this is also a thinner sock yarn than what I used for the replicas of these. So when I wear this sock, the fabric is stretching a little bit here and there, but really not very much. The ribbing is pretty much pulled in, and therefore it is really three-dimensional because my foot is, you know, 8 inches in circumference, and the sock is bigger than that. And so it relies on on pulling in order to fit to the size of my foot. But you know, there's so much room in this sock for a foot that's much bigger in circumference. This way I think it potentially could fit my brother, because there's just so much room for this to become the width of stockinette fabric and then stretch even more, as much as a stockinette fabric would stretch. So there is a lot of room, and because there's so much room, that means that there's a lot of room across this heel diagonal too. This is the place where I tend to have problems. It's the largest circumference of any part of my foot, including up here on my leg. This is larger than that. And so this is the area where I have trouble, but because there's so much extra fabric, there's plenty of room here. And I think that there would even be plenty of room if, again, for my brother's foot diagonal right here. So it would be an interesting experiment. I might make another sock that would fit my brother just to see what that would be, whether or not that would actually work. But so you know, this is roomy here. It's not as tightly fitting as I would want for a sock, but again, it would probably be fine in rain boots or just to wear around the house. But of course, if you had a bigger foot, it would conform to your foot a little more tightly than it does to mine. Well, that's it for this week's Casual Friday. If you have any comments or questions about today's video or suggestions for videos you would like to see in the future, you can leave those down in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.